Episode 201, Study Session 12, Development of Social Welfare. Introduction. Social welfare in its modern type started in the 1800s during the time of Industrial Revolution. The rapid industrial development paved way for the improvement in other areas. There was an improvement in the lifespan of the people due to the improvement in medical science. There was also a tremendous increase in population. However, this economic gain was not enjoyed by the majority of the population. This study session will discuss the evolution of social work. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to explain the evolution of social work in the 1800s. 2. Identify the problems that came up as a result of Industrial Revolution. 3. Explain the effect of Elizabethan poor laws on the colony of America. And lastly, discuss the objectives of the COS in America. Evolution of social work in the 1800s. The roots of social work can be traced to the latter part of the 1800s, when England was undergoing the so-called Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution paved the way and created pressure for improvement in other areas. One invention led to innovation or invention of another machine. Increased production created greater demand for raw materials, such as coal, cotton, and the creation of new industrial centers established new markets for the agricultural products. Improvement in these areas created pressure for improvement in transportation. More roads and canals were constructed, and the iron horse replaced the horse-drawn cart. These changes were accompanied by a tremendous population boom. From 1815 to 1914, the population of England more than doubled. This was due to improvement in medicine, sanitation, absence of major wars, which provided the necessary labor force that the consumers needed for an industrial economy. Unfortunately, the economic gains of this period were not enjoyed by the majority of the population. It was initially benefited only by the middle-class gentlemen farmers, bankers, financiers, merchants, and tradesmen, while the proletariat worked and lived under inhumane conditions. The new industrial centers did not have services or facilities required by the people they attracted. Inadequate housing facilities meant that several adults were forced to live in one-room apartments, which lacked proper sanitation facilities and proper ventilation. Communities degenerated into slums that were breeding places for diseases, promiscuity, and crime. Working hours were very long. A laborer could work from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. There was no insurance against accidents, no protection against sicknesses or old age. And because workers were poorly trained, accidents were frequent. The continual invention of labor-saving machines and the abundance of labor made available by the population meant low wages and frequent unemployment without compensation. Consequently, women and children worked to supplement the head of the family's income. Unfortunately, those who were in a position to improve the plight of the poor man maintained an air of indifference, largely because they made wrong assumptions about the extent of poverty. Many felt that poverty affected only a minority. They were indifferent because they made wrong assumptions about the cause of poverty. They believed poverty was self-inflicted malady caused by indolence, a failure to be thrifty, a deficient moral character. Charles Booth was one of the first to link poverty with a faulty socioeconomic order. In his book, Life and Labour of the People of London, he made a distinction between the very poor, who remained in a perpetual state of want, and the poor, who continuously struggled for the bare necessities of life. Contrary to the prevailing notion held by many, he maintained that poverty was a natural consequence of the order of things, that existing means of attacking the problem of poverty had been largely ineffective, and that the states should intervene to improve the life chances of the poor. Booth's idea of state intervention was not compatible with prevailing ideas of the Victorian age. There prevailed a great ideal of suspicion about government intervention. It was believed by many that the least government was the best government. State intervention would make man less sufficient. It would undermine the highly valued individualistic era, while those in power advocated democracy. It was limited democracy structured to protect the economic power of the wealthy. This suspicion was reinforced by a growing fear of the size of the working classes. The prevailing ideas of this day was reflected in Darwinian and Spencerian Darwin, that is, The Descent of Man, 1871, which theorized that life is a struggle for existence. And in this struggle, only the fittest survive. His ideas were closely aligned to those later advanced by Herbert Spencer, who contended that intervention by the state would rob man of his ability to adapt to the vicissitude of life. It would distort the natural course of evolution and prevent man from advancing towards a higher level of existence. We saw evolution as a process through which the inferior elements, that is, those who were mentally and physically handicapped, would be eliminated. However, the ever-increasing problem of poverty forced the state to gradually increase its roles. Parliament's reaction to the poor had always been one of repression. Workhouses and public relief was geared more towards protecting society and punishing the poor. In 1536, inundated by beggars and believing that almsgiving encouraged begging, Parliament passed a law arrogating the responsibility of almsgiving to churches only. Those who gave individual alms were fined, and the beggar was likely to lose an heir or his life. In 1601, Elizabethan Poor Law was passed. It established poor into their classes: the able-bodied poor, the impotent poor, that is, the unemployables, and the dependent children. The able-bodied poor were first to work. The impotent poor were placed in almshouses, and the dependent children were given out as apprentices. The law was amended through the years. The Settlement Act of 1662 made each parish responsible for its poor. Various amendments were made between 1662 and 1875, when Charity Organization Society (CSO) evolved. By 1722, the workhouse test was adopted. Able-bodied poor were provided a place to live and work, and were given relief in return for their toil. They were allowed to farm out the poor, that is, a practice that was later discontinued. Later, a system of allowance was set up, in which guardians of the poor collected wages and provided whatever additional funds were needed to support the family. This made matters more difficult for the poor, because it encouraged employers to pay minimal wages. So the Poor Law Revision of 1834 was a continuation of an already existing pattern. The Poor Law Revision of 1834 activated a doctrine of least eligibility, re-established the workhouse test, and established centralization of control. The doctrine of least eligibility meant that the conditions of those receiving assistance should in no case be so eligible as the condition of persons of the lowest class subsisting on the fruits of their own industry. In other words, no individual receiving relief should be better off than those supporting themselves. The able-bodied poor, who refused to live and work in the poorhouse were not eligible for any aid. It established 3 poor law commissioners who had power to coordinate poor law services throughout the country. Fortunately, the narrow repressive role was alleviated by that various private charities. While these various charity workers were motivated by a genuine desire to help others, they had very little impact on the problem of poverty. They had very little information about the kind and amount of help required. They knew very well about the other services available and often duplicated each other's services. Charity Organisation Society in England. It is against this background that the charity organization from which the oldest method of social work evolved was organized to coordinate the activities of different charity groups. It aimed to improve services to the poor through improved supervision and better coordination. It attempted to make a distinction between the deserving and underdeserving poor, to cut off the demoralizing effect of indiscriminate giving, to restore within the recipient a sense of independence. It mirrored the general society's tendency to attribute poverty to a weak character and inner deficiency. Charles Stewart Lodge, the most vociferous proponent of the COS principle, was appointed Secretary of COS in 1875. Charles was a deeply religious, strongly idealistic man who discontinued his law studies so that he could work with the COS. It is believed that he shared the sense of guilt which burdened other Christians of that day. The COS operated upon the following assumptions. 1. True charity evolved, restoring the recipient to a level of independence. 2. All coercive measures should be used to force the individual to become self-dependent again. 3. The family should be considered as whole. 4. The family should bear the responsibility of caring for its young, its aged, and its sick. 5. Thorough knowledge was required so that needs could be assessed and eligibility determined. And lastly, relief should be of adequate kind and quantity. The effectiveness of COS was reduced by its tendency to place too much emphasis upon thriftiness, by its preoccupation with detecting fraud, and by its means of obtaining funds. Instead of setting up a general fund from which money could be drawn when needed, the committee requested money after each case was assessed. This was the most ineffective method because the potential contributors frequently failed to respond. Qualifications for recipients. 1. The applicant must show that he has been doing all that is necessary to help himself. 2. He must be willing to report accurate information. 3. He must be capable of repaying loan. 4. If employed, the applicant must not be responsible for his unemployment. And lastly, the applicant must not be guilty of drunkenness or immoral behavior. The COS laid the foundation for the development of casework in that it recognized the importance of basing decisions about the client on information that was gathered through investigation done by the caseworker. It recognized the need to keep written records, although these were rather crude. The early social workers formed an important arm of the COS. They gathered facts used to determine eligibility, dispense financial and material assistance, and influence the poor to overcome their habits. They were dedicated workers, blinded by their prejudice and much too eager to render sermons about how one should live. The social workers recognized the serious threat posed by the sharp division between classes. The sick completely, out from the poor, remained ignorant of the poor, and were therefore unable to see them as fellow human beings, as mothers, as fathers, struggling through the waves of deprivation. The role of the social worker has been described as that of a social service sedative and regenerator. As social sedatives, they try to repress discontentment by making the privileged aware of their responsibilities as citizens to alleviate poverty. As regenerators, they try to rekindle the willpower of the poor. They felt that the poor must be raised to a higher level of existence. They try to replace apathy, hopelessness with willpower and self-help. The roots of group work extend outside the COS to the numerous groups that flourished during the 19th century, YMCA, and the Boys Brigade. Many of these groups were formed to protect the virtue of young girls and to provide recreational facilities. There were also the friendly societies that were set up to help the individual save for times of sickness or death. Social group work. The institutions that laid the foundation for social group work was the settlement house. The first settlement house, Toynbee Hall, was established by Kenan Barrett in 1884. The settlement house contained rooms for lectures, discussions, recreation, and lodging. Its main purpose was to provide a setting where the rich and the poor could mingle and learn from each other. The residents from the upper class could gain a better understanding of their poorer neighbors, and the poor could be exposed to the ideas, attitudes, and habits that could help them advance. Kenan Barrett was more interested in preserving harmony than in establishing economic equality. He again was more concerned with reforming the individual than with reforming society. Barrett borrowed the ideas set forth by the COS, in that he treated each case as an individual one and recognized the need to base decisions about needs and services on information obtained through investigation. He went a step further, in that he allowed the individual to participate in finding solutions to their problems. He felt that as the individual reads, play together, and as they discuss issues, relationships would develop that might motivate the poor to emulate their wealthier neighbors. Effects of Elizabeth Poor Law on the American colony. America has often been called the land of plenty and the land of opportunity. Perhaps these descriptive terms are true. For America, with its vast areas of fertile unclaimed land, although the Indians had lived there for centuries, because the Europeans, who had the superior weapons, did not claim the land. Perhaps these descriptive terms are true. For America, with its vast areas of fertile unclaimed land, rivers, climate that allowed large array of plants to be grown, offered many who had been squeezed out of the competitive economic arena a chance to start a new beginning. One had a chance to own property and to gain dignity and prestige, regardless of one's family's background. Yet, while it offered many opportunities, America was far from being a Garden of Eden. Many of those who migrated to America were ex-convicts, tax dodgers, orphans, who had been subjected to harsh treatment during the voyage, such that they arrived physically weak and unable to bear the harsh life required of new settlers. While there were many benefits to be gained, these benefits could only be gained through the persistent struggle against disease, climate, food, and fuel shortages. So the colonies from the start had to deal with problems of the poor. At first, because most were subsistence farmers who had frequently encountered periods of scarcity, they accepted the dependent aspects and often formed mutual aid societies that would allow them to pool their resources and draw from such resources when periods of hardship occurred. But as the population grew, more impersonal methods were instituted. The settlers of the New World transplanted many of the ideas, attitudes, and institutions that prevailed in the Old World. The colonial poor laws, like the Elizabethan poor laws, divided the poor into three groups: the able-bodied poor, the impotent, that is the lame, the blind, and the dependent children, and placed the responsibility of caring for the poor on the parishes and established financing through taxation. While they readily accepted the responsibility of aiding the poor, their generosity was not extended to strangers. New arrivals, who were looked upon as potential liabilities, were returned to the ship. Outsiders or non-dwellers had to get permission to visit a town from the town council. They, like their European forefathers, made the same assumptions about the cause of poverty. They still regarded poverty as an unnecessary evil caused by indolence and lack of initiative. The colonies eventually set up almshouses for the impotent poor that soon deteriorated into a cesspool for all, that is, the criminals, the handicapped, the children, the aged, etc. While America began as a colony of mainly subsistence farmers, she soon emerged as a great industrial giant, and she inevitably became burdened by the usual consequences that accompany industrialization: concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, migration of poor unskilled laborers to industrial centers, concentration of poor in standard houses, deterioration of neighborhoods into slums, exploitation of labor force. Charity Organization Society in America. The COS in America was an attempt to deal more effectively with the problems caused by rapid change. The first COS was established in 1877 in Buffalo, New York by Reverend Samuel Garland, who had visited London and had come to appreciate the different ideas expanded by that body. The COS in America was an attempt to apply the scientific method to charity work. Exponents of COS believed that sentiment should be removed from the business of giving charity, and that the underlying laws, discernible through a study of the past experiences, should govern the work of charity organizations. The leaders of the COS believed that the ineffectiveness of existing charities was due to ignorance about one another's methods. The organizers believed that charity should form a community in which each could benefit from the experiences of other societies. The COS did not offer direct relief to the poor. Rather, it proceeded to collect information and feed such information to the cooperating societies. For example, the first project undertaken by COS was the compilation of a list of all persons receiving relief. This was an attempt to prevent duplication of service and to detect fraud. The COS suggested guidelines that should govern the work of the friendly visitor. They felt that the friendly visitor should always be respectful and avoid visiting home at inconvenient hours, should relate to applicants as equals and avoid any appearance of condescension, should handle no more than 5 cases at all times, and should be a woman. The leaders of the COS felt that women made the best visitors because they were more observant than men, could enter places that were close to men, and were more adaptable. Social work emerged as the principal profession associated with the COS. The early SCW, social case worker, also accepted the view of the poor as morally inferior individuals who had failed to exploit the various opportunities available in society. In fact, this view of the individual was even more acceptable in America, given the historical background of most Americans who could look back on much leaner years when their fathers were dirt farmers struggling against nature and who had managed to reach a period of comfortable existence. Consequently, the early American SCW focused their attention upon changing the individual. They focused upon identifying, understanding and removing the lack within, while completely ignoring the pressure caused by the nature of the socioeconomic order without. They believed that the solution to the problem of poverty rested upon rehabilitating the individual and rekindling their sense of self-respect. Fortunately, there were many who departed from this point of view. Many friendly visitors concluded that the poor were burdened by problems such as unemployment, underemployment, poor training, inadequate housing, lack of protection against accidents, that made poverty an inevitability that were beyond their control. They concluded that many more were victims of rather than causes of poverty. Many contended that the amount of sicknesses, premature mortality among low-income groups far exceeded that which existed in less densely populated areas. The advocates of these ideas were called environmentalists. They felt that many physical evils nourished moral evils and became more concerned with solving practical problems rather than with uplifting the moral character of their clients. They pushed for legislation that would set standards for housing and wages, that would provide public education and public health and recreational parks. And so, between 1890 and World War I, social work went through a period called the period of environmental determination. It was during this period that social workers began to question an economic order that placed profit-making above the welfare of the individual. There were frequent disagreements between those who fought for social reform and those who continued to focus upon the one-to-one approach. After World War II, social work entered a new era called the psychological era. During this period, the social case worker began working with a different type of client, one who was not poor or burdened by material needs, one who did not need advice or how to be thrifty or on how to find a job. The soldiers and their families were middle-class clients who were burdened by psychological problems. During this period, social workers worked closely with medical doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, and began to gain insights about the inner dynamics that influence behavior. Also, during this period, Freud's idea began to dominate the intellectual scene. Freud contended that early childhood experiences influence the development of the personality. Social case workers were very receptive to the Freudian idea because they answered many questions that arose during their work with the poor. They were aware of the fact that many individuals remained resistant and indifferent in the face of any attempt to help, but they lacked the knowledge that could help them understand the problem, which they felt were rooted in the personality. This body of knowledge gave the social case workers greater confidence, greater trust in their ability to render a worthwhile service and change that image of themselves. Social workers no longer saw themselves as just a dispenser of relief. They saw themselves more as therapists capable of helping to better understand the underlying emotions connected to the problems. The Freudian school of thought provided them with a body of knowledge based upon the scientific method that could help them obtain professional status, so they readily assimilated into their vocabulary such words as the ID, that is the id, ego, superego, transference, defense mechanism, etc. Miss Mary Richmond began her work with the COS as an assistant treasurer for the Baltimore COS. She performed so well in this capacity that she was later given the job as general secretary, a position she held until 1899. In 1899, she took a job as a general secretary of the Philadelphia Society for Organizing Charities. Here, she proceeded to reorganize what had become a defunct organization. She introduced new case record forms, established a training scheme, and a new system of requesting contributions. She also became a social reformer and succeeded in getting the legislature to pass reform bills concerned with child labor, housing, desertion, non-support. It was probably because of these experiences that she was able to appreciate the importance of a social reform movement and the social case work method. She contended that while social reform was important, social problems were problems of individuals, and the individuals had to be helped on a one-to-one basis so that they could be motivated to take advantage of the improvements brought about by reformers. Her most important contribution to social work was made as the director of the charity organization department of the Roselle Sage Foundation, an organization concerned with studying, teaching, publishing in charity organization field. While there, she organized an institute for social workers. These institutes lasted for 4 weeks and gave the social workers the opportunity to adapt new skills and refine old ones. It gave them the opportunity to pose new questions and re-examine old certainties. It was also during this period that she began to systematically study the work done by social workers. This culminated into a book called Social Diagnosis. Social Diagnosis was the first attempt to conceptualize social work as a continuous process which could be analyzed, ordered, described, and transmitted to others. She divided the process into 4 parts: investigation, diagnosis, and cooperation with all possible sources of assistance and treatment. Social diagnosis was an attempt to formulate or define those factors that were characteristics of all work done by SCW, regardless of the setting. While it was published during the psychological era, it was largely sociological because it was an attempt to formulate a conceptual framework of what harm had already been done rather than assimilate those new psychoanalytic ideas borrowed from Freud. This work was enthusiastically received because it was the first scholarly work that described the unique technique used by social case workers. It helped to define the unique role that social case workers were played. During this time, the social case workers trying to defend their claim that they were professionals. In 1915, Dr. Flexner, a leading authority of graduate work, contended that the CS were performed a function that could be done by any warm-hearted person. He contended that the social case worker does not use any technical skill of their own. They simply help the client gain access to resources. Social diagnosis provided a vivid description of the special skill used by social case workers. The specific skills that justify their claim to be professionals as follows. 1. Combination Law of 1799 and 1800 that prohibited workers from forming trade unions. 2. Health and Moral Act of 1802, that is, children or working hours. 3. The repeal of combination law in 1824. 4. Factory Act of 1833, prohibiting employment of children under 5 years from working in textile industries and 9 hours for children up to 13 years of age. 5. Centralization Control of 1934. And lastly, the collapse of Chartists of 1848. Study session summary. In this study session, we focused on the roots of social work practice, and we noted that it can be traced to later parts of the 1800s in Europe and America, especially when England was undergoing industrial revolution. There were rapid inventions leading to innovations. There were pressures on infrastructures such as housing, roads, waterways, and more raw materials were needed for the rapidly growing industries. Workers were also needed. End of study session 12. Thank you for listening.